James smiled up at the Colossus happily, and he opened his mouth to give some sort of answer to that weighty statement. However, as he did, he suddenly felt a tingling sensation on his cheek. His brain immediately told him that it was some sort of bug running across his face, even though that was quite unlikely on the space station of all places, and he quickly wiped across his face in a reflexive motion to remove it. However, as he did, he felt something warm and damp on his hands, crossing some sort of wires in his brain, as he froze in place while his mind tried to figure out why exactly his face was wet. For a moment, he even looked around for anything that could possibly have hit him, even going so far as considering that it may have been a bird flying by. However, as he looked down at his fingers, the liquid was clear and water-like. "James?" Sheeda suddenly carefully asked him from next to him in a caring tone, causing him to snap out of his confusion to look at her. "Is everything all right?" It was only then, when he saw the concern on his girlfriend's face, as well as all the eyes directed directly at him from the rest of their team, that it finally clicked for him what was happening. "Yeah, I'm fine," he replied honestly, while reaching up once again to wipe the still flowing tears off his face with his sleeve. His voice sounded a lot croakier than he had intended. "I don't know where this is coming from." It was the oddest thing because he honestly didn't feel like crying. It was like his body was responding to what he had heard all on its own, without any input provided by his mind. Thoroughly clearing his throat to make sure his voice wouldn't sound whiny again, he added, "Sorry, this is really strange," with a brief chuckle. Wiping his face once again, he looked back up at Morgoth. "But thank you for your kind words. I can certainly use all the support I can get." The Ligor Mordalar seemed caught between confusion and worry for a moment. However, he seemed to relax at James's assurances that he was fine, as well as his clearly not all too troubled demeanour. With the medic that had patched up his arm seemingly dismissing him completely now, the enormous Class 5 began to stand up to his full height, entirely dwarfing all of those he was conversing with, and stretching out his body to seemingly shake off some stiffness. The large scales covering his back clattered against each other, and the digging claws covering his chest like a plate clacked as they shifted in place. Even his cone-like tail unrolled into a flat shape for a moment. All the humans stood a step back, instinctively worrying about possibly being caught in the Colossus's movements, even though he was just casually stretching. "Well then," Morgoth declared, as he had sufficiently loosened up, and his head tilted to look down at them all. "Would you maybe mind if I accompanied you the rest of the way back to the hive?" Rubbing his sleeve over his eyes one more time, really hoping that the waterworks would soon stop running without his permission here, James nodded. "You're very welcome to," he agreed with a smile. Morgoth nodded down at him and began to turn in place, causing the humans and Sheeda to take another careful step to the side, to possibly avoid his tail, although it seemed like the man was more than aware of his surroundings and very careful to not accidentally hit anyone as he moved. If James recalled correctly, just like humans, Ligor Mordalar also hailed from a super heavy gravity homeworld, even if its pull wasn't quite as strong as that of Earth ultimately, and so it made sense to see this giant person move so comparatively nimbly in standard gravity, even if it didn't quite fit with the things his brain naturally expected. "I really hope we can also convince the other Deathworld populations that we are not their enemy here," James said as they walked, deciding to make some small talk during the short rest of their way. "We really aren't out to make trouble for anyone, but things as they are just aren't sustainable." Morgoth nodded his large head, with his long ears slightly fluttering in the process. "Yes, Lavexar said much the same," he explained as he lumbered forwards. Keeping up with the Colossus of a person was odd, as he moved in long bursts with each large step he took, instead of steadily moving forwards. James was sort of used to that from his time walking next to Zodiatos back during his time on Ostnajar. However, in this case, the effect was even more noticeable, since he was dealing with a biped this time. "I must apologize for my preconceived notions towards you.
It seems that I didn't know the world around me quite as well as I thought I did. Your people just seem so divisive in their actions. Closing yourself off from the galaxy like you did, it felt counterproductive to me. But I see now that you never planned not to stand with others. Again, I am sorry.
James released an amused breath through his nose. Representative? The fact that you can admit that earns you a lot more respect from me than if you had supported me from the start, he replied reassuringly, always appreciating it a lot when someone could admit that they were wrong. Not too far away, they could already see the hive. So, what exactly does a Shepherd of the Caverns do? James continued his attempt at small talk, remembering that being part of Morgoth's exact title. Mort chuckled and reached up with one of his claws to scratch along the very edge of the protective scales along his back, causing the ones he glanced to rattle slightly.
I guess you could call it a mayoral position, he wondered aloud,
seemingly searching for a proper comparison.
The shepherd is the person tasked with keeping peace and order in the caverns under his care.
But it's also a family thing for you, isn't it? Coco asked attentively, after having gotten used to their huge company, joining into the small talk so she wouldn't be quite as bored while walking. You're a Strentane and Shepherd of the Strentane Caverns, right? However, Morgoth just laughed.
You have it the wrong way around,
he explained, clearly unbothered by the hint of an accusation that came through with Coco's question.
Everyone in the Strentane Caverns is a Strentane. It is not a family name in the sense that many other species use them. It is more that everyone who uses the name Strentane is part of the family, a brother or sister in name. Just as all other shepherds are my brothers and sisters in name, no matter the cavern they hail from.
James hummed and shifted his lips. So designations are pretty important to your people, huh? He wondered aloud with a glance up at the enormous man. However, Morgoth quickly shook his head in denial.
Only those I pick for myself, he replied quickly. I don't necessarily feel connected to everyone others see fit to throw me into the same bag with. My brothers and sisters are those who stand with me, and I stand with them.
In a moment of slight hesitation, Morgoth then looked down directly at James again and seemed to contemplate for a moment.
I have never made much of the whole Deathworlder label,
he then confided for a moment, his voice dropping a bit in volume, as it was carried down to James through the empty air in between them.
What others thought of my home didn't matter much to me, and so the name connected to that didn't either. However, I've started to see that it is more than that each one stricken by that label has similar challenges to contend with. And although I still feel like many of us don't have all too much in common, maybe we are all connected in our name as well.
James nodded. It would be my honor to call you my brother in name, he replied. The term Deathworlder has been used as something negative for so long now. I think it would be nice if we could all feel connected through it instead. I don't think it's all that important how similar we are or aren't to each other. It's as you said, standing together is a whole lot better than standing alone.
That it is, Ambassador Aldwyn, Morgoth agreed.
Call me James, James replied. And finally he felt his face drying again after his involuntary tears had stopped flowing. It's shorter. Morgoth let out a thunderous laughter to that.
That it is,
he agreed enthusiastically, giving James whiplash from the sudden shift of energy. Soon enough, they had all reached the hive. Almost immediately as they stepped foot on the flat roof of the structure, Coco took Sheeta by the arm and began to take her aside. It seemed she hadn't forgotten her promise/condition that she and Sheeta would have a long, serious talk with each other as soon as they had gotten back to their rooms. James wished his girlfriend luck and wordlessly said his goodbyes by quickly rubbing his forehead past her temple before she was entirely pulled away.
Would you care to join me and Levexa for some stimulating conversation tonight?
Morgoth suggested, shortly after the woman had left, far enough to be considered out of earshot, although his volume certainly meant they would still hear it. James sighed. Usually gladly, he replied, with an excusatory look on his face. However, tonight there's a lot of things I must attend to. There's a lot happening at the moment that will need my attention. So maybe another time, but not today. Thank you for the invitation." Morgoth nodded slowly in understanding.
"Then I shall leave you for now as well," the Colossus announced,
before beginning to turn in the direction of the conference hall of the hive.
"None to fear, James."
James snorted slightly. "What does it mean?" he asked.
"Half mountain strength," Morgoth replied. "Or more properly translated, half mountain strength be yours."
James nodded again. "Thank you," he said. "The same to you. And have a good night." With that, he waved everyone along as he began to make his way back to his own room. However, as he was almost there, he suddenly stopped, turned in place, and instead beelined it over to where one of his teammates had stopped in front of another door. "Hey," he greeted, as Tuya looked up at him in a quick moment of confusion. "Would you mind if I—" "Of course not," his fellow lieutenant interrupted him, clearly already catching on to what he was up to, as soon as she had shaken her first surprise. "She'll probably want to talk to you as well." James nodded thankfully, and stepped to the side to give her some room while she unlocked the door to the room she and her sister shared. "We're back," Tuya loudly announced into the room, and only seconds later Nia already came rocketing out, wrapping her arms around her girlfriend tightly, and holding on like that for a bit. "I'm so glad you're okay," she said, muffled since her face was pressed into the bend of Tuya's neck. Tuya gently petted her back as she held her for a bit. "Hey now, we called and told you we were, didn't we?" She tried to calm her down gently, with suppressed amusement in her voice. Nia pulled her head up to look directly at the mask covering Tuya's face. "That doesn't keep me from being glad that you are," she retorted directly, and tightly squeezed Tuya one more time before finally letting go of her. "Do you know the kind of heart attacks it gave me when I heard the news that the detention center was attacked right after you left to go there? That's why we called." Tuya continued defending herself, as she was seemingly a bit unable to see the situation in quite the same dire way that Nia was. It was around then that Nia's attention seemingly expanded enough to notice that James was there, too, having taken 2 more steps back to give the 2 of them the necessary room for their reunification, while he patiently waited for them to have gotten it all out. "James!" his sister exclaimed, before bursting forwards into his arms, squeezing him as she needed to hold on to him securely so he wouldn't suddenly disappear like a ghost who had only returned to mock her. "I am just not made for this life," she admitted under her breath, as James gently stroked across the back of her head to calm her down. "It's all right," he said quietly, feeling pretty bad about having worried her so much, even if it was hardly his fault. "It's all right." He got quiet for a bit, just stroking her hair as he held her, their embrace lasting a good bit longer than between her and Tuya. Then, finally, they let go of each other, and he looked at her face directly as they parted. "What would you say to me doing your hair for a bit?" he asked, immediately seeing a shine in her eyes. "So, someone is trying to make it seem like humans were involved in the attack?" Nia asked sometime later, after James had slowly taken the time to explain the events to her, while meticulously first brushing and then slowly braiding her hair, while Tuya sat by and watched, adding on to his explanations now, and then whenever she saw fit. "Well, not exactly," James replied, while finishing one of the braids by fixing it into his form, with a tiny golden ring that he clipped around the very tips of her hair. "Humans were most likely involved. Or, well, at least someone that looks close enough to pass as one, so either humans or Miat. They're not trying to make it seem like humans were involved, they're trying to make it seem like the UHSDF was involved." Important difference, considering the UHSDF is who James is most famously working with, while other big parts of humanity are already quite displeased with us for doing exactly that. Tuya added on to his explanation. "Meaning whoever is doing this is likely less trying to frame humans, and more trying to sabotage our efforts and give us a bad name back on Earth, at least if you ask me." James nodded to that, although Nia obviously couldn't see it as he sat behind her, while she had to look straight forwards while he manipulated her hair. And since your run-in with your old friends made you feel like people are already seeing you as someone who causes trouble wherever they go, you're afraid that they might succeed with that, Nia surmised from the combined explanations. Both James and Tuya nodded again. It's certainly going to shake relations, James confirmed for her. We better hope the investigations bring up some solid proof that we've been framed. Nia hummed. But don't you guys record everything you are doing? Wouldn't that prove that you had nothing to do with it? She wondered. To which James released a depressingly amused breath. Yes, we do, but try getting people to believe that, he replied, while preparing to braid the next strands of hair. Shadow ops are a thing that exists in the public mind, and the fact that there are no records of a supposedly illegal ordered operation isn't really going to surprise anyone. Yeah, that makes sense, Nia said thoughtfully, and felt quiet for a bit, clearly thinking of something else she could say to all of that. Obviously, James didn't expect her to have any deeper insights into or answers to the problems they were facing. He just needed to get it all out of his system and talk to someone he knew wouldn't judge him, no matter what he said. Our best shot is to investigate thoroughly, find the people who actually did it, and then get them to confess before the harm they did is irreversible, Tuya commented, very action-oriented. It's already irreversible, James reminded her in a flat tone. People are dead. Tuya flinched slightly at his words. Right, she admitted quailly, and looked to the ground, the metal piercing in her nose briefly glistening in the light. But you know what I mean. They have to be caught, James agreed with her. No matter if they want to cause trouble for us, specifically or not, we can't let murderers run around freely. Even if the people they killed were deplorable, they deserved a fair punishment, not a vindictive execution. Nia hummed in agreement. Then she reached a hand up, blindly reaching backwards, and putting her hand onto the side of James's arm, while he carefully manipulated her hair. James, now that this is your fault, she assured him, as soon as she had gotten him to hold still for a moment while holding onto his hand. Something like this had to be planned way in advance. They went in and out within minutes and vanished without a trace. They had an exact plan that they couldn't have only made after you actually showed up here. Uton would have given his confession and have gotten arrested no matter if you accepted the invitation to come here or not. And they would have busted him out whether you were here or not. You're not at fault here. James sighed. Moving his hand slightly to bring the one she held onto him with around, he leaned his head forward to press his forehead against the back of her hand, while exhaling slowly. I know, he whispered, as he hadn't wanted to admit that that was what had been on his mind here. But obviously Nia had seen right through him, without the need for him to say anything. I'm just in my own head, I guess. Kind of hard not to be. Maybe I'm not made for this life either. I don't think anyone is, Nia agreed with him, and turned around, with James quickly releasing her hair, so he wouldn't pull on it while she wrapped her arms around him for an embrace. James closed his eyes while he returned her hug silently. He didn't know how long they remained like this, and he didn't care either. He simply needed the contact. After they had finally pulled apart again, he fell backwards a bit and caught himself with his hands against the mattress he was sitting on, his eyes looking up to the ceiling. It was quiet for a minute or so before suddenly, vibrations began in his pocket. Pulling out his phone, he looked at the screen for only 1 second before groaning and running his hand over his face. Who is it? Nia immediately asked, to which James didn't reply, and instead simply lifted the screen so she could look at it herself. I was wondering when she'd call, he said, before turning the phone to completely hold it out to Nia, who took it from him without hesitation, just before he allowed himself to fully fall onto his back. Accepting the call, Nia held it up to her ear, allowing the people in her company to only hear her side of the conversation ensuing. Hello, Sophia, she greeted happily, before pausing and listening to the person on the other side, Yes, he's here, she then said with a look down at James. After pausing briefly to listen once again, she added, Probably wasn't in the mood to yell at you right now. Yes, we're all fine. What? Oh no, I stayed in our room. I didn't see it. Yes, I'm okay. Don't worry. Then she paused for a bit longer, just intently listening, while the air in the room grew quieter and thicker for a couple of minutes, while the Admiral explained who knew what to her over the phone. Finally she nodded, more to herself than the person on the other end who couldn't see it. Got it, she said. Do I have to tell everyone? Oh. Yeah, okay. Thank you for the heads up. Anything you want me to tell him? Okay. Goodbye. At the very end, she quietly whispers something that James identified as "and I you" in German, before she hung up the call. James exhaled. You know, you can tell her you love her out loud even when I'm present, he informed his sister, while reaching out his hand and getting his phone back from her. She was always good to you. You don't have to hate her on my behalf. Nia looked at him guiltily, but didn't say anything on the matter. He knew she didn't condone the things his mother had done to him, both in recent and less recent past, but he also knew that the Admiral had done a lot for Nia in the past, just as much, if not more, than he had done, so he fully understood that Nia couldn't get herself to hate that woman. In fact, it was basically the one and only redeeming quality that the Admiral had in James's eyes as well, so he truly didn't blame her for it. We're being pulled out, aren't we? Tia then asked, after giving the siblings a moment to silently mind each other, and she leaned her cheek into her flat hand. Yeah, but not right now, Nia replied with a nod. She said it would be too dangerous to let us stay here for too long, but we're at least supposed to stick around until the investigative forces arrive to really look into the whole situation. Andrich and Coco will be receiving the official orders right about now, and then probably send them on to all of you, but apparently you are all supposed to do everything you can to make sure evidence doesn't just vanish again while you're here. Tia exhaled through her teeth and furrowed her brow. Everything in our power, huh? I'm afraid that's not a whole lot, she mused, and closed her eyes in mild annoyance. And she was right. They didn't have all too much influence around here that they could try to use to protect the crime scene from tampering. Still, after the things that had happened so far, James could understand the urge to have people present to keep an eye on things, and maybe they could figure something out. Although, there was no way they would be let anywhere near the scene today or even in the very near future. Still, he was hopeful that at least as long as the Lacheset, who seemed hardly associated with those who had conducted this attack, were still in charge and conducting their own investigations, things would probably be handled properly, at least for a while. Only when the larger community's investigators would arrive would they definitely have to watch what they were doing very closely, but maybe he could convince someone by then that they had the right to look into things as well. Maybe. James's hands clenched into fists as another thought came to him. Maybe, just maybe, they would even have the chance to find the people who did this. It was unlikely, very much so, but the hope for it was hard to extinguish as it burned in the back of his mind. We'll do what we can, he said, with a kindling determination in his voice. This whole thing, it was very clearly a declaration of war from their opposition. Some player in this game was done playing it quietly, and they had declared it loud and clear. They couldn't just leave that unanswered. He looked at the phone in his hand and took a deep breath. I'll call them, he announced, as his hand closed a bit tighter around that device. However, then he paused and looked back at Nia, her hair still only half done. Right, he said, in a bit of awkwardness as he sat up and scooted back up to her. After I'm done here. Back in his own room, alone for now since Sheeta was still having her talk with Coco, James sat down on the edge of his own bed, the contact he had been given already inputted into his phone. After a moment of internal preparation while staring at the honey-coloured wall of the room, he pressed on the call function and waited. He wasn't sure if the time that had passed in the meantime was already enough for things to have calmed down in the medic tent. However, he was willing to give it a try. Worst that could happen was that he would be told to simply call again a bit later, even if his brain tried to convince him of many much worse scenarios. It took a couple of rings before there was any reaction on the other side, leading James to believe that maybe his call had indeed come too early. However, right as he thought about hanging up and trying again later, the call was picked up. "Hello, Pippa here." The familiar voice announced itself on the other side, causing James to perk up. "Hey, it's me, James. I hope Fiver told you that she would be giving me your number." He quickly explained himself. "Do you have a minute, or are you still up to your neck?" He could hear some rummaging sounds and minor bangs from the other side before she answered. "We're cleaning up, but I can talk." Pippa's voice finally replied from the other side. James exhaled slowly. There were, of course, a million things on his mind. Questions like how she was doing, how she had come to volunteer like that, what had happened to her after the GCS, and so on and so forth. However, he felt like those were all things he should let her tell him on her own accord, should she feel like it. Right now, he just needed to get his piece out. "Listen, I'm sorry for how things went earlier. This whole situation is just so messy," he said, and rubbed the back of his head a bit nervously as he spoke. I wanted to say that I admire what you're doing here. We haven't started this conflict, but please don't think I'm not aware of the damages that it causes. I am very aware, and I do whatever I can to mitigate them. But there is so much happening, and so many bad actors that a lot of innocent people are suddenly put in harm's way. And I can't help all of them, so I guess I just want to say that I'm glad that people like you are around. People who care and who help those who get unfairly caught in the crossfire. I know you may not think the best of me at the moment, but I just want you to know that you're doing an absolutely great thing. And even if you might not see me that way anymore, I'm grateful to have such great people who I can call my friends." On the other end of the call, he could hear the rummaging briefly stop. He blinked as he listened to the silence, the yellow wall in front of him being the only thing that returned his stare. "I said I don't blame you," Pippa finally replied with a sigh. "I know you were just pulled into all of this against your will. I mean, I was there, remember? It may have been a bit ago, but I was pretty involved back then." James released a tense chuckle. "Yeah, you were," he agreed, remembering her helping him out in uncovering what, back then, seemed to only be a case of unjust surveillance against him. Oh, the places time had taken them since then. It briefly got quiet again. However, this time Pippa was much faster to speak back up again. "So, you're flying with your Ma again now, huh?" she asked, still sounding a bit tense, but now also clearly honestly curious. "Kind of hard to believe. I mean, I freaked out when I first heard that she was actually an admiral. You kind of left that part out when you told us about her. But after the things that you did say, I'm surprised you can move enough mountains for you to associate with her again." James couldn't help but burst out in a single laugh under his breath. "Well, she has her ways," he admitted, while slowly shredding his nervousness through amusement. "Threatened to throw me in the brig if I didn't. But I didn't make it easy for her, I'll tell you that. Otherwise, I wouldn't be parading around as a candidate for councilman right now." They paused for a moment to laugh before he continued. "What about you? Still the coolest aunt around?" He could hear Pippa snort. "You betcha," she replied excitedly. "Kiddos are all over that volunteer work, helping people, flying all throughout space. They eat it all up. Just yesterday, my nephew Freeney called me and told me that some whippersnapper on the net actually made some sort of video essay about our little troop. Can you imagine?" James made an impressed sound. "Really?" he asked, fully ready to hear about someone else's work being put under the magnifying glass in a positive way for once. "Tell me more." "Yeah," Pippa complied. "I don't know if he specifically looked for it, or if it was just recommended to him, but whoever made that was actually quite well informed. The whole thing actually started with, wait, maybe I should get Fiver for a sec, because her patching up your arm on your first day was kind of used as a through line through the entire thing." James lifted his eyebrows and waited patiently while Pippa went to fetch their friend so she could weigh in on the conversation. As he did, he looked down at his arm, right where the fire scars ran across it. "I still have those beauty marks," James assured Fiver sometime later, after he had been told about the video essay in great detail, and also promised to watch it himself once he would find the time. "I know," he heard Fiver reply from the other side. By now, his voice had been put onto loudspeaker so he could talk to everyone on the other side of the phone at the same time. "I mean, it was all over the news," Cliff chimed in, having joined up with his mate and her colleague in the meantime as well. "The pictures of your hands raised up didn't just make headlines on Earth." "I still can't believe Sheeta actually got that injected into her arm," Pippa said, with a slightly jostled voice. "I can," Cliff contradicted her quickly, and James could hear some feathers rustling right after he said it. "I would get 100 litres of ink pumped into my arm for you." There was a bit of a chirping scuffle as he presumably expressed his affection to Fiver in some physical way for a couple of seconds, causing James to chuckle awkwardly as he waited for someone to speak up again. "But I'm surprised that's the arm people still focus on." Pippa was finally the one. "I didn't pay much attention earlier since you had it all packed up, but from what I heard and saw in the news, the new one's gnarly." James shook his head to himself. "Not really. It's just a robot part with some polymer pulled over it. Really nothing that would make people look twice if it wasn't especially on a body," he explained. And it really didn't take long until everyone was used to it. After the way Sheeta talked about prosthetics back on the GES, I also feared the worst, but honestly, she doesn't even bat an eye anymore. I know it sounds unreal, but it's really just the idea that people have about it that freaks them out, as soon as they're actually confronted with it. I mean, you've all met Curie. Took you only a couple of times until they didn't bother you anymore. "You know, you're not wrong," Fiver said after a moment of thinking, still sounding a little bit flustered after whatever Cliff had done to her earlier. "Course not," James said confidently, and all of his earlier anxiety had long evaporated at this point, and it was as if they had all never been apart. As they all took a moment to get their amusement out, Cliff suddenly piped up again. "Oh, darn, look at the time," he announced, causing a moment of audible unrest on the other side as everyone seemingly scrambled to get a look at the clock. "Goodness, where's the time gone?" Fiver concurred with him. "I'm sorry, James. I'm afraid we're going to have to cut this short now." James just smiled to himself. "That's all right," he replied without delay. "I hope you keep doing good work in the future. See you sometimes." "See you, James," Cliff replied. "Yes, and don't be a stranger," Fiver agreed. "Bye," Pippa chimed in at the very end. Then, the call came to a close. James exhaled and looked down at the phone for a moment while the room got quiet. And as he stared at the device, the urge suddenly came up within him to check up on someone else as well. Quickly inputting the contact, his call was picked up a lot quicker this time, not even getting through the first ring. "Hello, James," Avesalon's voice greeted him. "Is everything all right?" "Everything's okay, Avesalon," James replied calmly. "I hope you didn't get too much of a shock to your system after that grand reveal I did on the news." "It had to happen eventually," Avesalon replied, without much tone to her voice. "Honestly, I'm glad that it's out. No point in hiding as strictly anymore, now that the entire galaxy knows I exist. Don't tell me you called because you were worried about me. I've seen the news about what is happening on the station." James chuckled awkwardly. "Well, among other things, that was the idea," he replied honestly. "Oh?" Avesalon asked curiously. "And what are those other things?" James leaned back a bit. "Well, once you didn't have any need to talk anymore, I wanted to check up on Zisha D, see how he's doing." "Is he in shape to take calls yet?" he informed, and asked the AI, working as the Comaltopeno leader's personal assistant. "He is awake and alert," Avesalon confirmed for James. "Would you like me to put you through to him?" James raised an eyebrow. "That depends. Are you all right?" he asked first, before allowing her to redirect the call. "I'm fine, James," Veslon said, with an undertone of deep satisfaction in her voice. I'll make sure Zisha takes your call. Thank you, James quickly said, before the call was momentarily cut, only to be picked up by someone else a bit later. Hello, Ambassador. Zisha's voice came from the other end, and to James's relief, the man sounded as firm as ever. No traces of bedridden weakness remaining. How nice of you to call me. Zisha, James pleasantly greeted right back. It's good to hear your voice. How are you feeling? He could hear Zisha hiss through his teeth. It will take more than that to take me down, Ghostai, he confirmed for James. But thank you for your concerns. James released a breath through his nose. Good, he murmured, before pausing briefly, wondering how to proceed from there. You're calling about the children, are you not? Zisha then called him out with a hint of amusement, and James flinched at being so blatantly seen through by someone who didn't know him quite so well. That obvious? James asked hesitantly, causing Zisha to giggle. The kittens are fine, Zisha informed him, without answering to his inquiry. Some of them are still a bit hard of hearing after their explosion, but their signing has gotten a lot better in return. Also, your doctors are confident it can be fixed. That's great to hear, James said, holding back any further emotions on the topic. Zafaya has asked about you, Zisha then informed him, without being asked to. You really left an impression on that girl. James couldn't help a smile from creeping across his face. Tell her we'll come visit as soon as we can.